Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Dieter Veldsman, and today we will be talking about everything learning, learning impact, and learning measurement. And we've got a great guest joining us for that. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Alaina, welcome to the HR Dialogues.
Thank you for having me.
Before we jump in, tell us a bit more, Alaina, who are you? What brings you to our episode? What makes your eyes light up?
Well, this is an easy one, Dieter. What makes my eyes light up is data. I'm a giant data nerd. And in some of the questions that you shared prior to this conversation, you wanted me to think about my career and my past and advice I might give. And I'll tell you, when I look back at my 20 years as a professional, the one thing that ties all of my experiences together is the desire to just do a really good job and make a difference. So I'm just a little bit competitive, just a little bit.
Just a tad.
Just a tad. And so I found that data, I used to be an athlete. I was a dancer. I'm now a sprinter when I can get on the track, and I still love the competitive nature of athletics. And overall in work, I just want to do a good job. I want to be the best in every way possible. And the only way to do that, or to strive to do that, is to get good feedback, create good feedback loops. And all that is just data.
Fantastic. And you'll definitely find a couple of supporters here at AIHR whenever you start talking about data and evidence and what the facts and the insights tell us. Alaina, talk to us a bit about your business. How do you help people through the work you do?
So today, while I've been an L&D professional most of my life, and in every role that you could imagine, I was the trainer, I was the trainer of trainers, I was a professor, I was the educational researcher, I was the leader of a team. All the roles you can play in learning and development, I've played them. And today, I actually don't work with as many L&D teams. Dieter, you might not know this about me, but I mainly work with business owners today. The through line, the connection between my L&D experience and the business owners I work with today is that these owners, they own learning businesses. So a nice connection there. A lot of these folks have built very beautiful intellectual property, AKA they are experts in empathy, communication, leadership development, and these like minimum viable manager, for example. A good friend of mine does that kind of work. And they sell to learning teams. And so it's a really beautiful way to have all of the skill sets that I've developed over the years be supportive to an audience that really needs me and urgently. I will make the argument that one of the biggest challenges in why L&D teams don't measure or jump on the data bandwagon is that urgency isn't there. And we can talk more about that.
And I think it sets us up for our conversation so beautifully. And I approached you to join us on the show today because we get this question quite a lot around what is the value and the impact that, whether you want to call it learning programs, learning initiatives, education, etc., actually brings to the table. I won't be shy about this, that I think a lot of the models that we still use today is extremely outdated. And I think it talks to a world that is no longer as stable and predictable. I think we used to do a lot of pre-post measurement type of approaches. So, Alaina, I want to start off with a very basic question to you. And I mean, you advise a lot of business owners on this, but when we talk about value, and let's say I'm doing a learning program, what metrics would you typically start looking at? And it's probably not as simple as we sometimes think, right?
Many of the models, I think, are limiting because they overcomplicate what it is that we really need to do to show that what we're investing in is really working. And so the simplicity can really make a difference for folks who are struggling with measurement. And so what metrics should we be looking at? It's not really about the metrics, because I think that might put us in a box of trying to standardize. So not surprisingly, I am not a proponent of standardization across organizations. I do think you can create some standard procedures within an organization, and as long as everybody is bought in and understood why these systems and procedures matter and they follow them, then it will work. But what metrics we should use answer the simple question: did our investment do what it said it was going to do? Like, did we accomplish the thing that we invested in this program in the first place? So did we accomplish what we set out to accomplish? And so there's no standard metric that's going to answer that question. Though, when people pick the metrics and you look, if we were to do a study and we were to look at, one L&D team that does a variety of programs and initiatives throughout the year, and they're answering this one question: how do we know if we accomplished what we set out to achieve? How do we know that? What are we looking at? Those are data that are then metrics. You might see some themes. Like, we might look at, 10 or 15 programs that a team is doing throughout the year. When they answer that question, we see some commonalities, but there isn't going to be one thing or even three that would be applicable to all the programs and initiatives that a team is doing throughout the year. So I don't want people to fall into this trap. Like, I have to do NPS scores, I have to do satisfaction ratings, because if it doesn't answer the question, did your program accomplish what it was intending to accomplish, then you're just wasting your time.
I think there's also a point there that you make, rightfully so, right? That context does matter. I think in HR we do, and in L&D for that matter, we fall into this trap of trying to showcase value compared to something else. And I think that's typically where people try to standardize certain metrics to say, it was delivered in X time, at this rate, at this cost, at this level of satisfaction, versus actually rolling it back. And a lot of the teams that I also work with, we ask this question: what business problem are you trying to solve through your initiative? And I think people underestimate the fact that the real success, call it metric, measurement, value, what you want to call it, conversation actually happens at that part of the process. It doesn't happen post a lot of the things that we've tried to design there. So I think it's super valuable to start thinking about the fact that there's no one metric to rule them all and one metric to benchmark and showcase value compared to others. It does pose a question, Alaina, that I want to put you on the spot about then. So how do we get to what's important? And I'm playing devil's advocate here a little bit, but how will we know?
So, one thing that we can do, and this is sort of a way to create standardization where there isn't a standard. And I do believe it's important to be able to benchmark or baseline, or to be able to compare a sort of apples to apples. And so, the way that we would do that, which sort of answers your question, Dieter, is you could create like an alignment score. Like, how well is our program aligning to what matters to the business? And then you can have an alignment score for every single initiative that your team is accountable for. And then you can compare apples to apples. In our alignment score, this particular program is like clearly aligned to solving a business problem or helping to achieve a business goal, where this other initiative, the clarity is simply not there. And so what we would be measuring is how clear of an alignment story, or how clearly aligned is this initiative to a business outcome. And if it's not clear, probably it's not worth investing in. Similarly, that question that I shared about, did the program or initiative accomplish what it was intended to accomplish? We could have an accomplishment score, and we could have on a scale of 1 to 5, this program hit a 5 out of 5 on accomplishment, where other programs hit a 1 out of 5. And why we do that is because then we can look at all of our programs and say, well, the ones that hit a 5 out of 5 accomplishment score, which is of course where we're going, what happened? Like, what made us able to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish here? And then the programs that had lower scores, what was going on with those? Because then we can learn and say, oh, well, this is going to help us better in future programs, or maybe certain types of programs have a lower likelihood of being an accomplishment score. And let's look at that. What can we learn and then do differently, so that ultimately our time and money is being used wisely?
I think there is a point to be made around understanding your context, learning from your own components, and to take certain things over time. So, your example that you've used around the things that were successful in our environment, what did they have in common? The things that failed, are the things that we continuously end up doing? Because I think we don't spend enough time in that reflection, sense making. Let's look back, let's rethink how these things have played out. I do want to ask the question a bit, and I mean, I fully support, let's have an alignment score, an accomplishment score. Any HR professional, L&D professional listening to you today is going to say, I need to go and get my stakeholders on board with regards to this. So how do I sell this to them? Because the question is going to come, and I mean, we also ask it here, we've produced this program. What are the cost quality things that we should be looking at? Now, my view has always been that there's kind of tickets to the game things that you have to look at. And I think that's where sometimes you benchmark a bit to give perspective. But how do I get people on board with this accomplishment, alignment, strategic value type of thinking?
So you might not like this. I find in the world, there are two camps of people. There are the rule followers where we must ask for permission first. And if we don't have buy in, then we shouldn't do it because we're too afraid of what might happen if we get it wrong or if we fail. And then there's another camp of people who are like, fail fast, learn, ask for permission later. And you can probably guess which camp I'm in. And that is sometimes we don't need to ask for permission. We just need to take action. And in this case, we don't need our stakeholders to be bought in to creating an alignment score or an accomplishment score. We just need to do the work. And to be very honest, a lot of our stakeholders, if you're a learning team member or a learning leader, you are going to resonate with this, which is a lot of times our business leaders don't have a clue what learning does. They don't understand learning. And to get their buy-in to something that you know can make a difference, but they don't have a clue, it's just wasted effort. And so the value of having good data, of course, is to get our stakeholders to understand the value of what they're doing. And they're paying your salary and your benefits and all the things. Obviously, you should be doing something worthy of the business, continuing to pay your paycheck. And we do need to be accountable to that. That being said, I don't think we always need to get our stakeholders to buy into things when we can just find a way to take the action ourselves, because the real learning and value is for us. In programs where we really did accomplish the outcomes versus the ones that we didn't, our stakeholders don't care. They just want to know that we're using our time, money, and resources wisely. And if they do care, if you have a chance to present, here's how our learning function is managing its resources. These are the data points that we're using. Let your stakeholders weigh in if they want to, but they're going to be proud that you care.
I think as HR and L&D professionals, we sometimes underestimate the amount of science and technicality that goes into our field and domain that some of the key stakeholders won't understand. And I don't necessarily think it's their job to understand it either. Our job is to simplify and translate a lot of things there for them. I think it is important to have this balance between what are kind of our internal metrics that we want to look at, like we've spoken about here. What are the external metrics that we sometimes also need to educate people on? I always smile whenever people, whatever we want to use, right? NPS score, engagement scores, whatever else. Those things were also relatively unknown to business stakeholders at some point in time. So if there are things that's important to drive that education a little bit more, I want to double click because you keep on coming back to data. You keep on coming back to the fact that, it's the data that sets us apart. It's the data that we collect. It's the data, original data that you have. Talk to us why that has become more important, because I'll play devil's advocate. And I think a lot of learning programs, there is the learning felt great. It was a good experience. We need to go further than that. So what would be your advice there?
Well, I'll say that original data has always been important, and there's a few core things, but the ability to use some kind of data to guide you and to have something that you can compare. Here we are today, where were we at 8 years ago? And what can we learn as we use our own original data to make smart choices for the future? So this isn't a new thing. I do think, however, that in the learning and development sector and HR, or just sort of social human services in general, we probably haven't been as well trained or advised that we need people intelligence. Now we have things like people analytics, and Josh Bershin is like all over systems and AI around how we can ultimately have data that helps us to better manage people and get the best returns out of people who work inside of organizations. But that's relatively a new thing. But if you think about the term business intelligence, that's not new at all. Business data, it's just maybe how we collect it and the tools that we use and the software, now AI, that we can use to make better choices faster with the data that we've been collecting. So I think at the end of the day, L&D is just finally getting caught up with the essential business acumen that is needed for all departments to flourish, not just marketing or sales or product. HR and L&D need to be looking at their own analytics and intelligence to make choices too. And they also need to be pairing their own intelligent data with the data that other departments own and operate, because the cumulative story of what is happening inside of an organization, you can't understand the full story if you just look at one department. So all departments need to integrate together, which we can talk about that. That's a major challenge, but if we don't overcome that particular challenge, we will never be effective.
No, no, I mean, so many good things that you're mentioning there, right? So I think on our side, a lot what we see, working with HR and L&D professionals is exactly your point around the fact that basic data literacy, digital agility are competencies that tend to lag in HR professionals for very good reasons. Some of it is historic, some is the manner in which people enter the profession. But there is a reality we need to accept that it has become part and parcel of a lot of what is expected to come out of HR people, culture, learning functions for the future. I think you are right. And I actually got this question at a conference the other day. I was speaking, and my title, people are usually fascinated with the scientist piece in it. And they're like, but you work in the people space. What's the science that sits there? I do think that there's a lot more science than what people sometimes give social sciences credit for, if we use it in the right way. And we can do that translation that you've just mentioned around connecting it not in isolation, but connecting it to some of the business outcomes, business intelligence, talent intelligence that we do have. And Alaina, I want to bring us back to learning analytics, because I think that that's an area that you've definitely done a lot of work in. Help us understand how to get started with learning analytics beyond the things that we've always done.
How do we get started with learning analytics? This is an interesting one. And if there were a theme in this conversation, Dieter, I think it would be controversial. So I have yet another controversial thing to share. You asked in the opening questions for this conversation, how can we use learning analytics to tell the story of the value, prove the value of learning through our learning analytics? And the answer is you can't. Our learning analytics, if you think of it as a story, learning analytics are just part of the story of what unfolds when people engage in learning initiatives. There are a lot of other data points that we look at to understand the impact, or to prove that, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, did your initiative do what it was intended to do? We can't look to our learning analytics to find answers. We have to look beyond, as you've already said. We cannot operate in isolation and expect to tell a complete story of what became possible in the organization because we invested in learning and people development. Our learning analytics tools will never be able to do that alone. We have to partner with people in other departments until the day in which we are fully integrated, which some organizations are. Some organizations have all their data integrated, and they've got permissions and systems set up where the people that need to have access to performance data have access to it, and they can pull reports and they can look at correlations between the people that participated in training and what capabilities they have and how they're performing on the job. It's not difficult to tell that story, but if the institution has, we've heard things like data gatekeepers, and there are these silos. I mean, these are historic things that were essential for an organization to thrive maybe 10 years ago. The silo was efficient. Now it's not effective to be siloed because the data needs to integrate together. And so at the end of the day, learning analytics, the one thing that is essential is that we know how many people are completing a program. That's it. Like, I don't care how many times they clicked on something, unless it's compliance related. That's a different story. But if you're trying to tell the story of how are people performing or taking different actions, or even how they're thinking or feeling differently because they invested in a learning initiative, like, I don't care about clicks. I don't care about quiz scores. We can talk about that. Knowledge is not a leading indicator of taking different actions or performing differently on the job.
I think that's not just restricted to learning if you really want to understand and answer the original question, because the original question would have been a business question. It's not a learning question. So I think there is also that component to be okay with the fact that I have to operate in the bigger environment and the bigger ecosystem to start pulling these different elements together. Because I think that very often we try to solve it in our silo. I come from an organizational design background, so I absolutely hate silos. I think organizations don't work in that way. I think it serves the purpose of cost distribution and all those types of elements. It doesn't really serve the purpose, especially if you want to be a lot more customer and consumer focused. But I think it is an environment that you do need to prepare. So how do I get my organization, because I'll play devil's advocate here. I've been in those boardrooms where the questions that gets posed to L&D and HR is, how much money are we spending on this? Why are we doing this? What can you show for it? And then I think there's a natural tendency for us to default back to, we had so many people go through the program. This is the amount of time they spent. This is the number of quick clicks. This is the quiz score answers. These are the knowledge checks that they have. How can we help our stakeholders mature a little bit beyond that, or at least shift the conversation, I think, to start opening up something different?
We've been having this conversation for a long time. And I think it's important for us to really look at, well, why? Why are we still here? And it is that our stakeholders come to a conversation with a perspective. And stakeholders that don't have training in education or training in, now there's so many different programs out there that we have sophisticated education available on HR, L&D, technologies, all the things. And our stakeholders have had the same teaching experience that we all had, which was you sit in front of a classroom and you take quizzes and you take tests. Like, we have, unfortunately, the way in which the fundamental education system, at least in the US, perhaps in other parts of the world as well, we are stuck in an old model of education. And what that does is it makes people that aren't continuing to get training in education, learning, or development, if they don't continue education to understand the science and the nuances, then they will only ever know what they experience, which was,
Mm.
sage on the stage talking at you. There's no value in, project-based learning and group learning, and the students aren't invited to push back against the teachers. That's being rude. That's not learning. That's just a model of disseminating information that doesn't actually facilitate real change. And it's not actually, if you look at test scores, like, people really struggle, especially today more than ever. Young people are struggling. And the schools that are outperforming, they have wholly different educational models that are like, I could tell you about a school here in Austin that's, I think it's K-12. They only give students 2 hours of formal instruction, and then they work on projects where they're applying what they're learning in the classroom, and they're doing real world things with, they call them guides. They don't even call them teachers. So somebody has to take the lead to do something different. And I think it has to be the L&D team. It's not our stakeholders.
Maybe this is a little bit blunt, but I think there's a point of the purpose of metrics is not to showcase your value, it's to showcase the value of what you're delivering and the impact of what you are delivering. Because I do think that we fall into that trap a little bit of seeing metrics as a way to defend the work that we've done and almost as a performance metric. And I think that places too much responsibility and onus on the L&D team for what happens with learning, right? I know there's the stuff around, was it well scoped, designed? We can talk more about that. But there is ultimately also a responsibility in the organization to create an environment for these things to translate back into practice. There's an individual responsibility of the individual to say, I want to kind of consume what is being provided and apply it into my job. And I think then, to your point, where I agree, is I think we can stand up a little bit to start pushing a different narrative as long as we know where it's headed. And your point is absolutely correct. HR, L&D, there's a big struggle with the mandate of what people expect the functions to do and what they've seen in the past versus what a lot of the professionals and practitioners know is possible today, because the functions have shifted fundamentally in the last 10 to 15 years, right? If you look at what's around now and the type of conversations and the things that people are engaging in, but you do sometimes sit with a stakeholder audience, might not be their fault, but they do need education. And I think that's what good L&D, good HR people do really well. They meet the stakeholders where they're at. They show them something slightly different. They ground it in data. They start running a lot of these experiments and bring things back to the table. And I think that changes not just the positioning and the mandate, but also the types of conversations that as you've rightfully mentioned. So I want to ask this question to you because I think a lot of organizations, ask this question to say, how can I utilize learning and development to change culture, to change behavior? Now, I've been a firm believer that it's a part of it, but I think culture is an outcome of various different things. And I mean, there's all sorts of other factors that need to play into that. But how do we sometimes get over these myths that learning is the silver bullet that will fix absolutely everything? Because I also think people just throw learning at the problem, right? Even though that might not be the core issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it goes back to the idea that we must isolate any intervention. So let's take learning and development out of the conversation for a moment and let's just talk marketing. Because everybody understands marketing. And I think marketing is an interesting comparison because it's a major investment and it has expected outcomes. But would we ever say that marketing alone was responsible for an outcome? Or like this one marketing initiative drove sales? It might be 10 different marketing initiatives that work together to generate an outcome. And if you think about the terminology, we often talk in marketing about campaigns. A campaign isn't one initiative. It's literally we are investing in a system of things that work together to generate an outcome. And so I think about L&D, and we have one program, one leadership development program is supposed to fix the lack of trust between leaders and their right. Like it doesn't work like that. It's not a one and done. It's a campaign. So I love the idea. Let's think about how do we have a campaign, which is like, okay, let's use the campaign terminology where it originated from. If we think about government and we want to have an election, when we do a campaign, we aren't just doing one advertisement. We're not going to go to one city. We're not going to even target one population. We're going to put a very thoughtful campaign together that says, how do we reach this audience? And how do we have to show up differently to reach this audience? And what are we going to do to prepare for this debate differently than that debate? It's a campaign. It's multiple thoughtful initiatives that are all working together to get to one outcome, which is get elected. So I wish I knew how we got to this place where we feel like one L&D initiative, like let's send people to a retreat for 3 days and they're going to come back and they're going to have more productivity. They're going to like each other more, right? It doesn't work like that. I don't understand how we got to this belief today, but it is definitely not helping the L&D industry. And lots of people have written and researched and made recommendations for how do we get beyond this silver bullet thing. And unfortunately, it is a culture shift. It's not, there's no simple solution for that one. Though I am a big fan of simple solutions, this one isn't going to offer that. But I will say that small intentional steps do compound.
Yeah, I think there's also I think the point around the fact that a lot of change is systemic, as you've mentioned, and it is to view the whole organization as a complete system and say, what are the levers that I need to pull, of which L&D is one lever pertaining to that. So, Alaina, a couple of things that stood out for me, and then I've got one last question for you there. I think there's definitely, how do we solidify the mandate that we carry as L&D and HR professionals and bring a new conversation to our stakeholders? I think to start shifting away from this obsession with a list of metrics to rather start focusing on, but what is the business challenge we're trying to solve for? What is moving the needle really on that side? And what are the things that's going to influence this? I loved your idea around accomplishment scores and alignment scores. I think it introduces a very different terminology around why we do the things that we do. And then definitely the last one around the fact that it is systemic. If we want to try thinking about this thing, stop thinking that one thing is going to solve this. It's much more about understanding root cause, putting together the campaign. Love the analogy you used there. And then the solutions that we then build out as part of that. I think also to be okay that you don't own all parts of the solution. I think that's sometimes a big mistake that we make as HR and L&D professionals. Alaina, thank you so much from my side. I think a lot of really good things for us to go and reflect on. Appreciate your controversial view and appreciate you also calling out some of these things. Where can people follow you? Where can they get hold of you if they want to engage with you more?
I am 2 places all the time. One of them is LinkedIn. You can find me, Dr. Alaina Szlachta, on LinkedIn. I post regularly. I also have a Substack. I write weekly. You can type my name into the Substack dashboard and find me that way. And of course, I'm at dralaina.com.
Perfect. Alaina, thank you so much. And for everybody joining us for this episode of the HR Dialogues, hope to see you soon. And thank you so much for dialing in. Bye-bye.